there is potential to develop a network to encourage people to shift at least one of their trips to a bicycle.
Welcome back to Infrastructure Connections, the podcast where we explore what makes sustainable infrastructure work. Brought to you by the Infrastructure Sustainability Council. I'm your host, Seth Scott, and today we're speaking with Melissa Bruntlett. Melissa is the co-founder of Modacity Creative. She's a well-known cycling advocate working worldwide to bring cycling to a city near you. She's also an author who's written a wealth of knowledge into 3 books, Building the Cycling City, Curbing Traffic, and Women Changing Cities. She most recently appeared in the New York Times Women in Leadership Special Report. Hi, Melissa. Welcome to the show.
Hi, glad to be here.
Thanks for coming on. So you earned your degree in fashion and apparel design, and then you worked in graphic design, and then you shifted into this new passion for alternative modes of urban transport. Tell us about that journey a little bit.
Yeah. So I started out with very creative ideas in mind and did work in the fashion industry for almost 10 years. But there was an overlap there after moving to Vancouver in 2007 where the way I moved around the city began to change. And then for myself, my husband, Chris, living with 2 small children, finding ourselves working within cycling distance from our home and daycare not too far away. And so we started making our daily trips by bike, using a bike trailer for the kids that were 1 and 3 at the time, and really seeing how our understanding of the city began to change, how the kids' relationship with the city was changing, and even our relationship with each other. It was a much more social way to move around. We could talk a little more easily with the children. Everyone was just a little bit more at ease. And I think what happened was over the course of, I'm going to say probably about 2 years from 2010 to 2012, as our social circle with parents started increasing, we were fielding more and more questions about how on earth we were moving around the city with 2 kids on a bike and how do we make that work. And it was sort of this aha moment for both of us to be like, maybe there's stories that we can share. For myself as a mom, moving around with 2 kids, how do I make that possible? And what does that mean for us? But also, why is it important for the city to be making these investments?
So you went all in with this passion. You moved from Canada over to the Mecca of cycling, the Netherlands. What was the difference between the 2 cultures when you moved there and you saw the cycling there?
Yeah, the big thing is that it's just so normal. Where you see children as young as 3, 4 cycling on their little bikes next to their mom and dad on the bike paths, where you see older adults, people our parents' age or older, cycling around for social activities, going into the polders for, a weekend cycle ride. But for me, especially even as a woman on a bike who was defiant enough to cycle in skirts and heels in Vancouver, seeing here that it's just so completely normal. And it's not because the Dutch are somehow superior when it comes to their cycling culture. It's just these decades of investing in cycling has made it so much more comfortable and easy for people to move around for all their trips. So, not just going to work, but also taking kids to school, to doing groceries, to going to yoga class, which is part of my week, twice a week at least. Just these very, very normal ways of moving around in a mode that isn't a car suddenly makes, what you wear and the types of bikes that you ride and the way in which you ride a lot more easy and comfortable and, just nothing spectacular. But to us, it's still spectacular that it exists in this way, and it's what we're trying to, build elsewhere.
It's great to see that. And you've now become a major advocate for cycling. And you actually wrote a book about it called Building the Cycling City, the Dutch Blueprint for Urban Vitality. And I have to admit, I have read your book. It was fantastic. But unfortunately, I had to drive halfway across town to find it at the library because my bicycle has had the same flat tire it's had for 8 years. So don't gotta get out as much here. But I especially liked how you started your book with the Netherlands in 1973 introducing a car-free Sunday. And
Mm-hmm.
it reminded me, I lived in Minnesota for a year, and in the middle of winter, no one drove. And I used to walk down the 4-lane highway in the middle of the evening, and I just felt like the emperor of Rome. I owned it all. So, what made you decide to write this book?
Yeah, for us, it was we traveled to the Netherlands in 2016 with our kids for 5 weeks, touring around. We had been advocating for cycling by then for the better part of 6 years, having started Modacity in 2014 as this content creation firm to share stories, photos, videos. And so that became the basis of the pitch to Island Press for building the cycling city. To really dig deeper into these historical and cultural moments in Dutch society that have led to them being the cycling nation that they are. Because what we find, and part of the reason for the book, is to start dispelling these myths that, oh, it's the Netherlands, we can't do that here. And we still hear it. It's been 8 years since we wrote that book. We still hear that every time we're talking about the Netherlands or at a workshop, talking about Dutch principles. Well, that's all well and good, Melissa, but, it's flat there, or they've been cycling. The Dutch are born on bicycles. We can't do that here in XYZ North American or otherwise city. And our whole purpose with the book was really to say, but we can. It doesn't have to be copy paste, but there's so much that we can learn from what's happened here that we can apply in other places.
But your book pointed out that the Netherlands wasn't always a cycling country. So how did that start? Starting with that 1973 wake-up call with the car-free Sundays, and
Yeah.
also, I guess, right after the war as well.
Yeah, so I mean, just like everywhere else in the world, starting in the late 1940s, early 1950s, Dutch cities started to retrofit very much for the car. The car was seen as this tool of the future, just like it was in US cities, Canadian cities, cities around the world. And you see this mass adoption of this new tool for moving around. You see plans to demolish parts of Amsterdam to create a highway that connects the main part of the city with the north. You hear about in Utrecht, for example, the building of a motorway by filling in one of the historic canals not too far from the central station. And all of this is this movement towards modernity to create this new car-focused utopia, so to speak. And then in 1973, you have these car-free Sundays that happen as a result of the OPEC oil crisis, where the national government, in the effort to conserve the resources that they have, said, okay, no one is driving on Sundays, we're implementing car-free. And suddenly you have people coming out onto the streets and seeing them in a whole different way. For the last, let's say, 15, 20 years, they've seen the number of cars on their streets start to increase, the congestion increase, the hostility in that space increase. And then on these Sundays, suddenly these streets are massive public spaces where people can come out, they can cycle and roller skate along freeways, they can have picnics in the middle of the street. And it really opens Dutch people's eyes to what they were starting to lose with the mass adoption of cars. And at the same time, you have this road safety crisis that is reaching its peak around 1972, 73, where you have thousands of people dying on the streets in road crashes, particularly young children. That sparks a movement called Stop to Kindermoord, or in English, Stop Child Murder. Where parents, healthcare workers, teachers are all coming together to protest to the national government to demand that streets become safer again for kids. And so these two inflection points are sort of this moment where the Dutch realize we need to be doing something different. There's a couple of pivotal leaders, or not a couple, a few pivotal leaders that decide to be brave and try something different. And that's when you see in Groningen the adoption of the first traffic circulation plan to remove the free flow of cars in city centers. You see here in Delft the first woner for living street, where cars are removed from the equation to create essentially a living room in people's front gardens. And then you also have here in Delft the adoption of the first bicycle network. This idea that if we want to get people on bikes, we need to create a network that connects them to all the places they need to go intuitively and in a way that ensures they don't necessarily have to think about where they're going all the time. And this is when you start to see this shift from what would be a city not unlike Brussels, Paris, Rome, to something that now people see in Amsterdam, in The Hague, in Rotterdam, and everywhere in the Netherlands, of these wonderful cycling cities where, people of all ages, abilities, backgrounds are on a bike for all of their trips, because it just makes the most sense.
As you pointed out, one of the things we often hear from urban planners and civil engineers is that the city's built already and it's built for cars. So it's quite spread out. There are huge parking lots in front of malls. Everything's a long distance away from itself. And that grid is already locked in. How do you then adapt that to a bicycling lifestyle? I understand how it would work in a city, especially in a denser city or the central city. But how does it work in the urban sprawl areas?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing we often point out to people, in the place that I know most of my more technical colleagues will start, is to ask, what is the length of trip that most of these people are taking on a daily basis? The challenge in a lot of cities outside the Netherlands is, and even here sometimes, is everyone is so focused on the commute to work, the distance and number of kilometers, miles, roadways you need to use to get from home to the office and back again. And we want to make that trip as efficient as possible. It's also the longest trip most of us take in our day. Very few of us live within a 5-minute walk of our office, or 30 steps downstairs in my case.
Unless we're lucky enough to work from home. Yeah.
Exactly. But when we focus so much on the commute, we actually forget all the other trips that we take that are usually under 5 kilometers in distance. And so starting from that point with cities of saying, okay, well, what is the distance from these journey start points to a destination that is a school or a community center or the local grocery store, and mapping those out and starting to realize they're all within this 5-kilometer radius, which is very easily cyclable within 10-15 minutes depending on your speed, and even that 1-kilometer radius for walking. And once you actually start looking at the grid in a much smaller way, then you can see how perhaps in an urban sprawl suburb there is potential to develop a network on the street or through trails and otherwise to encourage people to shift at least one of their trips to a bicycle. And then from there, you can start to say, okay, we have this grid, let's say in this neighborhood, how do we now connect another neighborhood, another node, and then find those connection points. And eventually you have an entire network for a city. But what's really important is it's not just about building separated bike lanes, which is important depending on the speed and volume of cars on these streets. But you can use neighborhood streets, which is very much the approach in a lot of North American cities. It's the approach in Vancouver of how can we calm the neighborhood streets where speeds are 30 kilometers an hour or less in a way that it makes it more comfortable for cycling, that it becomes an option for people instead of having to have that fight of building that bike lane on the major arterial. Maybe there's opportunities to build out our neighborhood cycling network as well. I still argue that we need that separated infrastructure on arterials because those are the destinations that people want to get to, and we need to ensure that the cycling network connects them to those important destinations as well. But it's not about building bike lanes everywhere. It's about this sort of complementary system of bike lanes where they need to be, where, like I said, the volume and speed of cars is too high to have that mixing between bicycles and automobiles, because the results of a crash will be catastrophic, with a network of traffic calm streets that allow people to cycle within their neighborhood and in their community, in a shared environment, but where everyone's moving around at a much more human pace.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I don't ride a bicycle, is because I'm afraid in my car of hitting other cars. I would be even more afraid without a big steel box around me. So
exactly.
creating that environment that allows that safety while you're riding, it's definitely a plus.
Mm-hmm. And we really we need to understand that, how we feel in traffic or how we feel in our cities is going to influence the behavior in which we move in those spaces. So, if we want to encourage people to walk and cycle, we need to create environments where they feel comfortable doing that.
Yeah, in one of your books, you'd pointed out that streets with less traffic or slower traffic tended to have more people crossing the street to go back and forth between businesses or friends, and that was actually measurable, that the more car traffic there was, the less safe people felt and the more uncomfortable people felt in that area.
Yeah, in Curbing Traffic, which is our second book, we look at the study from Bruce and Donald Appleyard, one that was done in the 70s and then updated a little bit more recently to understand people's relationship to a street depending on the volume of cars. And what they found, even in the 70s, was on streets with a light traffic volume, people were more willing to be outside, to take care of the street, because that stress and hostility of cars moving through very quickly or at high volumes was lower. There was less noise, and they felt more willing to connect with their community. And so the heat map that we show in the book shows these, like you say, these constant crossing points or these social gathering points on the street that are very high volume. And what we know from that study is as the volume of traffic increases, the frequency of those crossings begin to stop. The care for the front streets, the stoop, begins to lower, and people are less likely to care for front gardens or clean up garbage that might be there. These kinds of things. But interestingly, they also begin to, in their own homes, move their activities to the backs of their homes. And if we think about this in sort of this more urban sprawl or city living, people value their back gardens because it is these quiet oases where they can be away from traffic, away from, noisy street life, and have their own space. But really, when you ask people what they value this idea of community connection, this idea of knowing who your neighbors are. And we can only do that if we create street environments where the traffic is much lower, so that you can hear your neighbors if you're having a conversation. But you also begin to trust your neighbors more because you are in the common space together much more.
It's interesting that people respond so much to the street even within their houses. And in fact, you mentioned that well-designed cities incorporate walking, cycling, and staying. What's the staying part of that?
Yeah, the staying is, I think it's an important ingredient. It's something that a lot of us in this space are now really starting to focus on, is how do we create public spaces that are enjoyable to stop in, not just move through. And if we think about this in the context of people taking, holidays to Italy and spending time in the piazzas and enjoying a coffee, there are these wonderful sort of squares that people want to spend time in. And that's the staying part, is creating spaces where it's a place that you're happy to stop, to have a conversation, to maybe sit down at a table and enjoy a conversation or a coffee with a friend, or a beer if you're going to do that. And it's this idea that we're lowering the stress to make that space much more enjoyable. And these can be, they can be very simple activations, or they can be much more, permanent. But we see great examples around the world of this happening. Of course, in the Netherlands, we have the big market squares that in our case in Delft, in the last 20 years, have shifted from being parking lots to now being big open squares where they have our weekly markets, where we have festivals and all these kinds of things where traffic is not moving through in terms of car traffic, but people traffic are moving through and staying. But then also in places like Barcelona with the super blocks, these, former intersections and neighborhoods being transformed into public squares where people are coming and enjoying time together and staying simply because the environment is much more welcoming and inviting to do so.
Yeah, it's creating a healthy environment for people, which I was interested in the research that you're doing on the health of people. You'd mentioned, for example, that we might have that increasing problem of isolation and loneliness and dependency, especially with the elderly and the children, because they're dependent on cars to get them to other people. I was fascinated to learn that our current modes of transport can impact that. So tell us about how modes of transport reduce isolation and dependency.
Yeah, well, when we're able to cycle and walk, and we create the spaces that are safe to do so, or safe and comfortable to do so for more than just the fit and the brave, so to speak, or in some some places they might refer to them as mammals, middle-aged men in Lycra. But when we create an environment where it becomes more comfortable for children to cycle or for older adults to cycle, you're basically opening up the environment for more independent travel. And what that means when we're looking at children is that as we're seeing a generation become more and more dependent on mom and dad to move them around in a car, they don't have an understanding of their community. They don't know the street network. They can't find their way in the same way that those of us who would have grown up walking and cycling to school or to friends' houses would. And that dependence closes the world off to them, and they start to feel like the only way they can leave their home zone is with mom and dad taking them around. If we flip that and say, okay, we're going to create traffic calm streets in your neighborhood to get you to school, playground, sports clubs, etc., comfortably on foot or on bike, or create a street grid or a city grid that allows them to travel a little bit further, parents suddenly become more comfortable because they know their children will be a little bit safer when they move around. Of course, there's some travel smarts that are required, but you also see kids thriving in this. And that freedom is important for children. I think it's something that those of us, I'm going to age myself, but those of us that, grew up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s got to enjoy at a much different scale than kids nowadays do. They learn their street grid better. They have this connection to their community. They'll see that old neighbor and say hi to them as they pass by. And there's a visual connection that happens that they wouldn't have if they were in the backseat of a car. But also they're learning about risk, and they're learning, where are my limits? If I make a mistake, how do I learn from that and adjust so that as they grow up, they those lessons help inform their view of the world. But also with those moments, parents are less worried that they're going to not come home if they happen to fall off their bike on their ride to and from school, which is a very normal occurrence for most kids. And the same sort of goes for older adults, is that, with these safe infrastructures, with these slower streets, for a generation that is aging out of driving safely, we're saying to them, you have the right and the access to still be a part of society. For people where their mobility is getting a little more challenged, we've created these comfortable environments where you can do so, where there's seating if you happen to be walking. The cycle paths are nice and wide and comfortable for you to continue moving in a way that makes sense for you and allows for people to still maintain that connection without worrying about being trapped in their homes or reliant on older adult children to move around.
Yeah, you'd also, with the health aspect, mention noise, and it's something that I only noticed during COVID. I actually live in an area that has 3 major highways on 3 different sides of me, and there's a constant background hum. I hear it most especially at night, which is odd because I guess it's drowned out by other things during the day. But during COVID, it almost disappeared completely, and it was so incredibly quiet that it really made me recognize what that background hum sounds like and how loud it normally is. How does that affect people in general and their anxiety and stress levels?
Yeah, I mean, noise is something that a lot of cities around the world are starting to come to grips with, and the World Health Organization has now set what they believe is a suitable decibel level for people to not experience extreme negative health impacts. But at the very basic, if you've got this constant background noise, it sets your brain into this constant fight or flight mode, which, I mean, of course, that puts you in this high alert stage, which sometimes we need in our daily lives to know that we're maybe not in the safest environment, that we need to be more aware. But if that's constant, then our stress levels are constantly higher. It has an impact on our cardiovascular system, our mental health, of course, because we're constantly like something might go wrong. And over time, prolonged exposure does mean that those health impacts become much more severe. And that's, of course, when you're moving around in the day, but at night, it also disrupts sleep patterns, which has an effect also on our physical health, not just our ability to rest. And so what most people experience during COVID is this like, oh, I can hear the sounds of life in the city again. And there's a correlation there because we had more people working from home, less people driving on all of our highways or streets. And there was a recognition that a lot of that noise that we hear in our cities is actually due to the cars moving through, not just the engines, but also the rumbling and the friction of tires on streets, moving around. You hear it actually quite starkly here when you have even an electric car moving along a cobbled street. It's very loud when you hear that rumbling noise because the cars are
Yeah.
quite heavy. And so, as people were more walking and cycling through their community, suddenly things were quiet. And, we need that. We need those restorative moments for our well-being.
It's interesting with electric cars because now we're seeing that people have range anxiety where they won't buy an electric car unless they think they can go 4 hours in that vehicle. When,
Yeah.
like you said, most people only travel 5 kilometers on average for most of their trips. Who's managing this transition, and how is it progressing, and how are they doing it?
I think the places around the world, and from the advocacy perspective, that are approaching it from an understanding that not everyone can cycle, and that is the point, is that we need to be capturing that 70 to 80% of people in most cities that are interested in cycling but are too afraid to give it a try, or don't feel like the network connects them to where they want to go. It's not going to solve every trip, so they're not quite willing to give it a shot. The cities that recognize that, the advocacy that recognizes that, are the ones that are approaching it in a much more holistic way that will allow for a more nuanced approach. It's not going to happen overnight. This is a 50-year journey here in the Netherlands. Our hope in our work is that with all of these lessons that can come from places like the Netherlands, all the mistakes that they made back in the 70s and 80s can be learned from to expedite the process elsewhere. But yeah, it's really about, thinking beyond who we might assume are the people that cycle to all the other people that might choose to get on a bike if we just understood how they feel in traffic and how we can make them feel much more comfortable.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you, is how long do you think this is going to take to really improve, especially downtowns of major cities in this way? I know that's a tough question. And like you said, it's been a 50-year journey for the Netherlands. Hopefully, with all of the examples that have been set, it can be a much shorter time period.
Mm-hmm.
But with the cities that you've worked with, what's the time frame that you see that really turns this around?
Yeah, that is a difficult question because it's different for every city.
Sure.
But I think it starts with leadership, either from the advocacy side, well, a combination of leadership from the advocacy side and from the civic society as well, is a bravery to do something that seems unpopular but is actually quite popular for most people. And once you have that, then you can start to move a little bit faster. And so, I got started in this living in Vancouver in Canada, that in 2003, let's say, before I moved there, had, virtually, they had a neighborhood bikeway network, but virtually no network. And in the span from 2007 to when we moved in 2019, a lot more places in the city suddenly became accessible by bike, including the downtown, including other neighborhoods and the waterfront. But this all comes from this connection between understanding who is using the system, who we want to use the system, and then designing for it, and recognizing, as with Anne Hidalgo, as in Montreal with Valerie Plant, as in Barcelona, as in New York, as in Vancouver, it might seem unpopular because the loudest voices are telling you they don't want this, but the people that do want it they're not coming out to all the public meetings. They're not making it known that this is what they want. But once it's there, they begin to start using it.
It seems like that ties into what you called empathetic mobility. And I really liked what the phrase that you used to describe it was, that it was a translation from me to we. How does
Mm-hmm.
that work, and how does that help that society adopt this?
Yeah, like again, it comes to this, what I was just talking about in terms of this thinking about what seems to be popular or unpopular. And most of the time when we are talking about creating places for walking, cycling, and staying, we're talking about changing what we understand of a public space, of a street. And it's really about shifting the idea of what the street is used for. It's not just meant to be one person in a car by themselves going from home to work. These are meant to be our public spaces where we come together. And that is it. That is civic leaders, advocacy, understanding that all of these changes are about creating spaces that invite people to be a part of the communities in which they live, in which they travel through and visit. It's about understanding that my needs, the way I move through a city, are going to be very different from yours, different from other people in the community. And with empathetic mobility, it's understanding all that and bringing all those perspectives to the table so that we can create a solution or unleash the potential of a street that better meets everyone's needs, that creates spaces for play for children, places for rest for older adults, smooth areas to move through for our disabled communities, safer environments socially safe environments where women feel comfortable to travel at different times of day. And really, shifting our thinking to a much more community-based, collective approach as opposed to an individualistic.
I think that's fantastic. I think we could talk about this for 3 more hours. I notice I've only gone through about half of my questions, unfortunately. Half of my questions is not enough. But I guess the good news is that you have 3 books that people can read to get on top of all of this. So I'll definitely put the links in the comments below. So I really enjoyed having you on the show. Thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for this great information.
Thanks, Seth. And if you ever want to answer the rest of those questions, just let me know.
Will do. Thank you very much. And thank you for listening to another episode of Infrastructure Connections. Please take a moment to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and we want to know what you think. Leave a message in the comments below or drop us a line at the Infrastructure Sustainability Council. Stay tuned for the next episode of Infrastructure Connections.